So we've heard this morning that fatigue is a bit of a problem. Mike introduced us to the idea that we have to start doing something about it. She talked about some of the performance impairments or consequences of fatigue. Things like errors, health issues, reduced productivity, and safety incidences. But let me ask you, how would you know if fatigue is playing a role in these components of your organization? Well, there is a method that I use, and I'll talk about it in the next 40 minutes or so. It is also used to help understand whether or not circadian desynchronization, like Miriam introduced us to earlier this morning, might be increasing fatigue levels and decreasing performance. It also helps you understand, or could be used to understand, whether or not the medical errors that Najib talked about this morning are related to fatigue. How many of them are being caused by fatigue? So if you are working in the healthcare industry, you might be able to use this, what I call a two-step method, to understanding whether or not fatigue is contributing to those medical errors. Now, the two-step process, it came about when I was working for the Transportation Safety Board. They brought me on to help them understand if fatigue was playing a role in these major Canadian federally regulated transportation accidents and incidents. All of the moto investigators had a hunch that fatigue was contributing to plane crashes, train crashes, pipeline accidents, and marine accidents. But every time they included fatigue as a contributing factor in the report, it would go to the 5-member board. They would review it and say, well, we don't, we're not quite sure. We kind of think you're on the right track, but you haven't substantiated it or investigated it well enough to convince us, so take it out of the report. So they brought me on, and over a period of about 5 or 6 years, I helped them better understand how to look at fatigue. After leaving TSB, I took the method even further. The method I left behind is great for seasoned accident investigators, people with 5-10-year history of investigating accidents, but we don't all have that. If you're looking at safety incidents, you might do a couple a year, that's it. So the method that I now use is much more applicable to us. We can easily use it. It involves 2 steps. First step is to understand whether or not the actor or the people involved in the accident incident were fatigued. The next step is to understand, so what? So they were fatigued. Well, we all know that, well, maybe not all of us, but all of the young people out there know that you can text and drive and not crash your car. But we also know that it increases the risk of an accident. But every time you text, you don't crash your car. So you have to link texting to the crash. Same thing with fatigue. I think we heard some stats earlier this morning about how often people drive fatigued, the comparison between Canada and the United States. Quite a few of us have driven while fatigued, but you might not have crashed your car. So again, it doesn't guarantee you're going to have an accident. So you have to link the 2 components before you're able to say, yeah, fatigue is a risk, but it's also causing these negative outcomes. Therefore, we have to do something about it. Okay, I'm going to illustrate this 2-step process with a bit of a case study. This was a rather tragic accident that happened in the United States involving a motor coach company that was offering shuttle service from Waterbury, Connecticut to Niagara Falls Casino. In this case, what happened was motor coach crashed, killed 5 people, 42 injured. Only 1 person on the bus walked away without injury. And it happened something like this. So this is a pictorial of the bird's eye view of the accident scene. On the left-hand side of the screen, you see the road he was traveling on, that the driver was traveling on. It was I-90 in upstate New York. And he was traveling, for the purposes of our illustration here, from bottom to top. Okay? As he's approaching the off-ramp, which is the curved line at the bottom of the screen, he starts to veer off the road. He's doing 65 miles an hour, 104 kilometers an hour. As he drifts off the road, he then goes fully off the road, out of the lane, down this grassy embankment, 104 kilometers an hour. He's flying down there, and then manages to get all the way to the on-ramp leading people back onto the I-90. That's the line leading up from the right-hand side. Hits a steel girder, steel rail, guardrail, pulls 700 feet of it with the bus into, you can see just sort of 3 lines at the upper right-hand side of the screen. That's another roadway. Pulls it into the roadway, strikes 3 cars, bus flips over onto its side, continues skidding, and by the time it's done, we had the 5 people dead. So that's the basic dynamics of the crash. So how do you know if this one was related to fatigue? How do you know if the driver was fatigued? So remember, first step is to try and figure out if the driver was fatigued. So if you were to imagine what it would be like being in this bus, I think it would probably be something like this.
On a normal day, the cameras on this bus catch little more than a long, boring commute. This is not a normal day. It's a scene of unimaginable devastation. The driver falls asleep right as he's approaching a traffic jam. And with his foot on the accelerator, the bus becomes a battering ram. Not even the screams of passengers wake up the coachman. Commuters are sitting ducks as the mammoth transport blows them to pieces. They pile atop each other like cordwood as their occupants hang on and pray. Finally, the man wakes up and slams on the brakes. But it's way too late. And now, the cleanup begins. An accident that took 15 seconds to unfold and wiped out over a dozen cars will now take days to sort out. And for the victims, a lifetime to forget. It's a miracle no lives were lost when this driver dozed off and became everyone else's nightmare.
So a bit of theatric license obviously taken with that video, and it doesn't quite match the crash dynamics we're looking at, but it's pretty typical of what you would see within a bus, truck that is involved in a significant motor vehicle accident due to fatigue. Okay, so if you had not known that we were at a fatigue conference, going back to our Niagara Falls scenario, how would you know if the person was fatigued? How would you know if the actor was fatigued? Well, one of the things you could do is you could try and go back and measure that person's fatigue. So I'm going to walk you through a measurement tool right now. So if you've got a pen and paper handy, get ready to write some numbers down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read a few statements to you. In those statements, kind of put yourself into those scenarios. Think back across, say, the last month or so, and try and determine what would happen to you, and average it out across the last month. So in each of the scenarios I read, I want you to rate them as 0, 1, 2, or 3. In that scenario, if there's no chance you'd fall asleep, write down 0. If there's a high chance, number 3. Somewhere in the middle, 1 or 2. Okay, so the first one, sitting down and reading. Average it out across the day. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? 0, 1, 2, or 3. Okay. Next one, watching TV. Now remember, when you're watching TV, chances are you're probably at home or friends or family's house. So if you start having the head nods and people start giggling at you, it's not super embarrassing. Okay. 0, 1, 2, or 3. Now put yourself in a public situation where you have strangers possibly watching and laughing at you. A little harder to fall asleep then. But still, what's the likelihood you would fall asleep? Next one, you're a passenger in a car driving along for about an hour and you haven't taken a break. But you trust the driver in this case. Okay? So you're not white knuckling. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? 0, 1, 2, or 3. Next one, right about now. If we were to allow you to lie down and try and sleep, what's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? Okay. 0, 1, 2, or 3. Okay. Next one, sitting down and talking to somebody. You have to like the person in this case. So you want to stay engaged in the conversation. 0, 1, 2, or 3. Sitting quietly after lunch without alcohol. Now, you're not talking to anybody. You're just trying to listen to Clint yammer on for the next 40 minutes. What's the likelihood you'll fall asleep? Okay. Next one. Now you're no longer the passenger. You are the driver. What's the likelihood you would fall asleep if you were stopped for a few minutes in traffic? You've hit a snarl, you've hit a construction zone, and you're stopped there for a few minutes. You're not moving at all. What's the likelihood you'd fall asleep? Now add up your score. Add up the numbers you just wrote down. So what I had you do is what's called the Epworth Sleepiness Scale. We use it in research and industrial settings to gauge how the workforce is doing with respect to fatigue or sleepiness levels. It's not meant as a measurement of how somebody's doing right now. Because remember how I phrased it? I said, average it out across the last month. If you were in those scenarios, what would you do? I didn't say, how are you feeling right now? Right? So how you feel right now might be totally different. We use it in the clinical world to differentiate between different types of symptoms that people might be experiencing. In the sleep lab, you'd get people coming in and said, hey, I'm really tired. I'm tired all the time. And you'd have to distinguish between, are they tired from what I call lethargic fatigue, where it's not really sleepiness fatigue? Are they tired because they're physically fatigued, they move around all day long? And your reason you want to distinguish between the different types of fatigue is because you treat them differently. Somebody who's got this lethargic fatigue might have anxiety, depression, and you're going to treat that differently from somebody who's overly sleepy. People who score high on the Epworth Sleepiness Scale typically have sleep-related fatigue, not the other type of fatigue. Okay? So in our discussions today, it's a good questionnaire for gauging overall fatigue. Other ones are the KSS and the Samprelli. Now, here's what the average scores are like today. About 7 or 8 is average across everybody, okay? Not in the shift working world. Shift workers and very reliably transportation workers normally score higher on this. So if you're looking at this and saying, oh, 7 or 8, I'm a little higher than that, well, you're shift workers, and that's pretty normal for that group of people. Other types of questionnaires you can use to measure fatigue are, as I mentioned, the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale. The way the KSS and the S&P are designed are for discrete moments in time. So they ask questions like, how are you feeling right now? Are you having trouble maintaining alertness? Are you having trouble staying awake? Are you fighting sleep? So they could be better if we went back to our motor coach driver and said to the driver, okay, you just crashed. Fill out this questionnaire. How fatigued were you? But the problem with doing that is the driver's just had a crash. That's pretty stressful, pretty alerting. So it could mask any fatigue that person is experiencing. So you wouldn't get an accurate answer. Okay, well, maybe we go back 2 weeks after the accident, and we say, okay, think back to your accident just before you crashed. What was your fatigue level like? Well, the problem there is this driver has now had a week or 2 weeks of other experiences that are going to cloud that score too. So questionnaires like this, they're not the greatest way of measuring or estimating a person's fatigue at the time of an accident or incident. A better way to look at it is to look at comparing the sleep the operator, the motor coach driver, or in my terms, the actor obtained, to what a good quality and quantity night of sleep looks like. I call this textbook normal sleep. Mike talked about on the fatigue risk trajectory. You look at sleep opportunity, but you also look at sleep obtained. That's what we're doing here. We're looking at sleep obtained. Okay? So the reason you compare the sleep that the person obtained to this concept of textbook normal sleep is because textbook normal sleep is refreshing. It's restorative. So if you get your textbook normal sleep, you're going to feel pretty good during the day, and you're going to be able to maintain alertness and a pretty high level of functioning, or at least satisfactory, throughout your whole day until your brain and body are ready to sleep again. Any difference from that, any movement away from that, the greater the likelihood of fatigue. Okay? So there are a few ways that you can move away from textbook normal sleep, but let me tell you what textbook normal sleep looks like a little bit. So textbook normal sleep, we heard from Miriam, it's night. We are diurnal creatures. It's monophasic in that it occurs normally in one long consolidated period, 7-8 hours. If it's monophasic, it means it's also not interrupted by frequent awakenings. So the old term pager duty, if you're getting woken up throughout the night and trying to return to sleep, you might still get your sufficient quantity of sleep, but if it's interrupted all the time, it's going to be poor quality, and that can result in fatigue. It's controlled by biology. We heard about the SCN, our circadian timekeeper. Okay? That tells your brain and body when it's time to sleep. So it's controlled by biology, but it's also influenced by environment. Again, Miriam's great example is light impacts how well you sleep. If you're trying to sleep in a brightly lit environment, your sleep's going to be poor quality. Sleeping in a cool environment, a noisy environment. Okay, so you have to think about what environment people are sleeping in. And an ideal environment is cool, quiet, dark. Okay? It occurs at approximately the same time every day. We're programmed to run on this 24-hour cycle, which means your 8-hour sleep period should happen about the same time every day. The normal range, depending on what literature you read, is anywhere from about 6 to 9 hours. Outside of that range, and you start to become sort of a non-textbook sleeper. And there's usually some other explanation for it. Okay? And you're usually fatigued. It's also divided up into 4 different stages of sleep. You've got light sleep, which is referred to as stage 1, stage 2. And then you've got deep sleep. So Najib talked about sleep inertia. One of the reasons sleep inertia is more severe when you sleep it a little longer is because you often wake up from deep sleep. Deep sleep is the furthest polysomnographic state, so the brainwave state, from wakefulness than you'll ever experience. So you're in essentially an altered state of consciousness, and trying to reverse that quickly doesn't happen. And then you've got your REM sleep. REM sleep is this dreaming sleep. Call it paradoxical sleep because it looks like almost like you're awake. Textbook normal sleep gets divided into this distribution. Most of it, as you see, is stage 2 and REM. When you wake up frequently in the night, what you're doing is you're disrupting the normal transition through the sleep stages. So if you wake up from deep sleep and you try to go back to sleep, you don't go back into deep sleep right away. You have to start what we call your sleep cycle over again. So in this hypnogram, you'll see a bit of a U shape. Okay, so the red is deep sleep. The bluish violet is REM sleep. You'll notice that as we transition across the 8-hour sleep period, so 0 is beginning of the night, 8 is the end of the night, there's a U shape where you start off in light sleep, you go down into the deep sleep, you come back up into the light sleep, you have a bit of REM, and then you repeat that process. That's a sleep cycle. So every time you wake up, you disrupt that sleep cycle, and it results in poor quality sleep. You might still get your 7-8 hours, but it's not going to be distributed according to the sleep stages we've talked about. Okay, so how do you mess this pattern up? How can you diverge from textbook normal sleep? I look at 6 different ways that people can become fatigued in this 2-step process. First way is to disrupt your sleep in the short term. So in the last 24 hours, you don't get enough sleep or you mess up the quality of sleep. You can be awake for a long period of time. We've heard figures around 17, 18 hours is where fatigue reliably increases and performance reliably drops. So the longer you are awake, more fatigued you are and the worse your performance. Circadian rhythm effects. If you're awake when your brain and body thinks it's time to sleep, you're going to be fatigued. Plus, if your circadian rhythms are not entrained or synchronized well, just by virtue of being totally desynchronized to the clock time, to light during the day, but also all of your internal circadian rhythms, if you're internally desynchronized or externally desynchronized, you could be fatigued all the time. This happens in extreme cases where people are working all sides of the clock. They never know when they're going to work. They never going to know when they're going to sleep. Okay? You can also have some sort of medical condition, psychological condition, illness, or consume something like a medication or a drug that can impact your fatigue. These conditions usually contribute to acute sleep disruption, continuous wakefulness as well. You can take things that make you feel fatigued. One of the things that lots of people take to make them feel fatigued is a sleeping pill. Okay, so you take sleep medication at the wrong time, and then you drive or operate a motor coach like our actor did, you could be fatigued. Sleep disorders contribute to fatigue as well. There's currently close to 90 different medically recognizable sleep disorders, and most of them have fatigue as a symptom. So you can walk into a sleep lab, get diagnosed, and come out with one of close to 90 different problems. Okay? You can also experience what we call a sleep debt. This is a chronic disruption to your sleep, often referred to as partial sleep deprivation. So you don't have huge changes to your sleep. You have, say you're a 7.5-hour sleeper. You've got your sleep finely tuned to that time period, but now you sleep only 7 hours. And you repeat that night after night after night. The missing sleep can build up into a debt. Okay? So let me illustrate the two-step process just with one of these risk factors. And the one big one we're going to talk about is this concept of sleep debt. Sleep debt is essentially an estimate of the lack of sleep, how much sleep you are missing. There are very easy ways to do this, but they're not quite as accurate. You can simply look across, say, the last 5 days. Supposed to get 8 hours of sleep. You get 5 hours of sleep across, say, 5 days. Well, now you've got 25 hours of sleep. You should have got 40 hours of sleep. You've now got a 15-hour sleep debt. Not that accurate, because if you're not asleep, you are awake. So less sleep time prolongs the wake time. And remember, one of the risk factors is being awake for too long. So a better way of calculating sleep debt is to use this concept of you need 8 hours of sleep for every 24 hours of life. So 8 hours, 24 hours of life, 8 hours of sleep leaves 16 hours of wakefulness. 8 hours of sleep, 16 hours of wakefulness. Now we have a ratio of 1 hour of sleep buys you 2 hours of wakefulness. Knowing that, you can pump that into a formula and get an idea of just how much sleep you might be missing. Let's work it out on your sleep. See where your sleep debts are like. This is difficult. I can't really remember what I slept last night, but let's give you a bit of a challenge. Think back to Monday night. Somewhere on your paperwork there, write down how much sleep you obtained Monday night. Okay. And then Tuesday night, how much sleep did you obtain? If you don't know exactly, just estimate. Okay. And if you're like me, of course, last night is even hard to remember for how much sleep I obtained. But think back to last night. How much sleep did you get? Now add that score up. Add those numbers up. Now let's look at the wakefulness that you experienced across the same time frame. Okay? So after you woke up on Tuesday, how long were you awake before you went back to bed? Write that down. Yesterday, how long were you awake? Write that down. And then from the time you woke up this morning to now, how much wakefulness have you experienced? So if you're up at, say, 6 o'clock in the morning, what are we at now? 1:30. So what's that? 7.5 hours of wakefulness. Now add up all of that wakefulness. Now divide that wakefulness by 2. Having divided your wakefulness by 2, now we can compare the sleep you obtained to the amount of wakefulness. Was it sufficient for the amount of wakefulness that you got? So here's the overall formula on the bottom line here. Take your figure for wakefulness and remove it from the amount of sleep. So total sleep time minus total awake time that you've divided by 2. And what do you get? Okay. A couple of tips here when you're calculating a sleep debt. Always start the calculation, if you can, from a sleep period. So you give the person the benefit of the doubt. You build a neutral baseline. Negative number equals a sleep debt. And a significant sleep debt, although there are 6 fatigue risk factors I look at, having a significant sleep debt could be enough to conclude that the person was fatigued. Okay, so looking at your numbers, is that too big? Is it acceptable? You might also be thinking, well, what if I'm not an 8-hour sleeper? Well, you can adjust the ratio, and I believe this is in your material, to calculate it if you're, say, a 7-hour sleeper. Okay, so how big is too big? Well, if you accumulate a sleep debt quickly, within a day or two, as little as a 2-hour sleep debt can result in performance impairments like you've got a blood alcohol level of 0.045%. A 4-hour sleep debt can give you performance impairments like you've got a blood alcohol level of 0.095%, which is higher than the legal limit across Canada. But in general, we look at sleep debt accumulated in a longer period of time, 5, 7, 14 days. In these cases, as little as an 8-hour sleep debt can be like missing a whole night of sleep. Think about the last time you went without a night of sleep and how well you might have driven home or driven to work. A 10-hour sleep debt can slow down your reaction time by 140%. Okay, now let's go back to our motor coach driver. Okay, so this motor coach driver has a bit of a backstory. And the backstory goes something like this. On Monday to Thursday nights, the driver was able to obtain about 8 hours of sleep. So in this graph, blue is sleep, black is awake. The sort of whiter cells are likely awake. Each horizontal line is a 24-hour period. So he was able to attain a few nights of good quality sleep. And then on Friday night at 12:30 at essentially Saturday morning, took the motor coach full of passengers, started driving from Waterbury, Connecticut to Niagara Falls Casino. Gets there at about 7:30 in the morning. Now, none of this is confirmed. There's no data to support the sleep that I'm going to tell you about, so chances are it's even worse than this. But what we think happened, or what the report thinks happened, is there was a good a slim chance that the driver, after he arrived in Niagara Falls at the casino, might have obtained 3.5 hours of sleep. Why so small? Well, because you went to the casino. 12 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, he goes to the casino. Hangs out at the casino all day, doesn't come back to the casino until 10 o'clock a.m. So there for almost 24 hours. Okay? That's where the big black line is there. Then, after returning to the hotel room, might have obtained maybe 4 3/4 hours of sleep. Then he goes back to the casino again, late Saturday afternoon, 1600. Stays in the casino all night long again, comes back to the hotel room about 9 o'clock Sunday morning. There's a chance Sunday morning he might have snuck in maybe a 2.5-hour sleep before starting the drive home from the casino to Waterbury, Connecticut. Doesn't make it home, of course, and ends up crashing at about 1500. Okay? So this is sort of what we're able to, or the report was able to piece together, gave the operator the benefit of the doubt of as much sleep as possible. If you work out a sleep debt, this driver accumulated a sleep debt of a little over 15 hours in a relatively short period of time, the equivalent of missing almost 2 full nights of sleep, and then started driving the motor coach home. What I do when I'm doing my analyses, when I'm doing my investigations, is I never trust myself. So I need some sort of second sober thought to look at the data and make sure I haven't missed something. One of the techniques I use is putting the sleep-wake pattern that I've been able to build into some sophisticated biomathematical fatigue modeling software. One of my favorites is a tool called FAST. It's the Fatigue Avoidance Scheduling Tool. The tool, these advanced software programs, can give you estimates of fatigue and performance impairments. So that's what I did with this sleep-wake pattern we were able to generate. And what I found was, just like we calculated, the software said that the person likely had a sleep debt of about 15 hours, which is what we calculated. It also said that the person's reaction time, our actor, our motor coach driver, would have had a reaction time about 180% longer than a normally rested person. It also said that with these conditions, with these performance impairments, they would have been driving like they had a BAC, a blood alcohol concentration of worse than 0.08%. The other thing it showed was that the person would have had about a 9.4 likelihood of a lapse index. So 9 times as high to have a lapse. What's a lapse? Well, a lapse results in things like this.
Under the terms we're offering, you get a substantial payment without any impact to your property via drilling and extraction. And rather than waiting years to close, Mr. Gatwood is offering cash on the barrel right now. Given the cost of overhead, liabilities, and other burdens Mr. Gatwood assumes, we believe this offer is more than fair. We believe this offer is more than fair.
She just experienced a micro-sleep, a brief transition or intrusion of sleep brainwaves into awake brainwaves. Barely perceivable. But during those 2 or 3 seconds, you're essentially unconscious. So when you start feeling head nods, those are long microsleeps. Stop doing whatever you're doing. So they are short disturbance or short intrusions of sleep into wakefulness. A whole series of microsleeps isn't going to help you. Microsleeps are not restorative. Okay, so let's look at the picture now. Given the high level of sleep debt, 15 hours, plus close to 9.4 times as likely to have a microsleep, it's highly likely that our actor, our motor coach driver, was fatigued. Okay, so now we've got at least a risk factor to deal with here. We've got a risky person operating a motor vehicle. Now we have to look at, well, so what? Did it play a role here? Okay. Long before the microsleeps happen, long before the head nods happen, or you start to fall asleep, you start to see some pretty reliable performance impairments. You start to see poor problem solving, decision making gets flawed. It's hard to hold things in working or short-term memory. And the two that are very important for driving are reaction time and attention, or in the fatigue world, we call it the ability to maintain vigilance, the ability to stay focused on driving. When you start becoming fatigued and experience long reaction times, inability to maintain vigilance, it results in crash dynamics that look something like this. That was pretty close, but it's pretty typical of what you see in a fatigue-related car crash. There are 8 characteristics that are seen in a lot of fatigue-related MVAs. First one, and it kind of makes sense when you think about the performance impairments I just mentioned and how fatigue works. They don't usually occur when the driver's doing something. So they're not actively trying to negotiate a turn or actively negotiate a 4-way stop. They're just trucking along. Okay? So they're not really doing anything except booting along the road. They typically drift out of the lane. Well, that's attention or vigilance there. They're not able to maintain their lateral position because it's hard to pay attention. There's no corrective action seen just before the crash. Well, think about reaction time. Reaction time, as we've documented in our actor, 180% longer. You're not going to be able to react quickly enough. So absence of reaction or really, really long reaction time. Only occupant of the vehicle is typical. And think about that for a reason, for a moment. If you got somebody else in the car with you, you can mask fatigue a little bit by having conversation. Or if the other driver sees your head nodding, they can alert you, hey, let's stop driving here. Only occupant, you don't have those same risk management components. Driver's male. Male drivers tend to take more risks. And I would add the younger male too. anywhere up to about 30 years old. You see a higher prevalence of car accidents. Occurs between the hours of about 0-100 to 0-800. There's our circadian trough. Okay? Occurs in rural areas with high-speed highways, usually in the neighborhood of about 88 plus kilometers an hour. And that makes sense again too. Rural roadways, there's not a lot of stimulation there. You're driving along, you see trees and trees and trees, or if you're in the prairies, you see nothing, nothing, nothing. Likely to be considered a serious crash. We'll put all the other dynamics together. You're traveling at 104 kilometers an hour. There's no corrective action. There's nobody to tell you, hey, buddy, pull off the road. That's sort of a recipe for a pretty significant accident. So let's compare the crash dynamics and the performance impairments to what we saw in our actor, in our motor coach operator. Well, if you look at them, look at the characteristics we saw, it matches probably 6 out of those characteristics. Okay? So what you see is that there was no pre-crash maneuver. Okay? So he wasn't actually trying to negotiate. This is a different configuration. He wasn't actually trying to get off the highway. He's trying to stay on the highway. There was a good drift out of the lane down that embankment. There's your poor reaction time, poor vigilance. No corrective action. There was no skidding there. There was no sharp turn to try and avoid that crash. Driver was male. It occurred in a rural area. You can see that it's not a city center. And serious crash. Yeah, 5 people dead. That's pretty serious. So the crash dynamics match what we know about a crash, about fatigue-related crashes, and we can relate that back to the performance impairments we saw, things like poor reaction time or slowed reaction time, inability to maintain vigilance. So what you can now say is that, okay, we've got somebody who's fatigued. There was a risk there. So what? Well, what we saw was in the actor's actions, they were pretty consistent with what you'd expect from somebody who is fatigued. It matches the research on crash dynamics, on performance impairments. So you can be pretty comfortable saying, yes, this person was fatigued, and yes, it played a role. So if we think of an overall conclusion here, and you're trying to build an argument for change, not only do we have a risk, we've got a fatigued actor driving a motor coach, but we've got actions performed by the actor that are consistent with fatigue. Matches the 6 out of 8 characteristics. Overall conclusion, fatigue was definitely a causal factor in this one. And if you read the NTSB report, that's what they said. Okay, a couple of take-home points here. First of all, drivers never drive with a sleep debt. Second one, as safety professionals, people involved in safety, try to think about looking at this one big risk factor when you're trying to determine if fatigue played a role. Was there evidence of a sleep debt that was perhaps too high in your operator, in my terms, in your actor? Okay. Second one is, as a safety professional, if you're involved in designing an incident assessment process or incident investigation process, use this 2-step method, and you'll build a strong case for change. Not only do we have a risk, but yeah, it's causing performance impairments that cause negative outcomes. Okay? Now, great. Taught you how to investigate accidents, but why do you want to wait for something bad to happen? Why not think about, Mike introduced this idea of measuring and monitoring performance impairments and fatigue up front so that you can be proactive and stop the incident, stop the health consequences, stop the lower productivity from occurring. There's a few ways that you can do this, and one of the easiest is to go back to those questionnaires that I talked about, the Epworth, the Karolinska, the S&P. Measure fatigue levels in your people. You haven't waited for an accident to happen, but now you've looked at fatigue. So you can do it very simply using questionnaires like that. You can have people fill out sleep-wake diaries and then look at whether or not any of the 6 fatigue risk factors are evident in the sleep-wake diaries. That's the low-tech method. Or you can use high-tech methods. One of my favorites is the system that's on display by Fatigue Science. It's called the Readiband system. This system uses sleep-wake patterns based on the movement that you experience. And the assumption is if you're moving, I'm wearing one now, If you're moving around, you're awake. If you're not moving around, you're asleep. So it documents sleep-wake patterns. It then analyzes those sleep-wake patterns and gives you an assessment or an estimate of how fatigued somebody might be and their performance level. The nice thing about this system is that it's not just all retroactive. You're not looking back into the past, which you can do. It can actually provide you with a bit of a prediction of how you're going to perform given the sleep-wake that you've experienced across the last 7 days, how well you're going to perform into the future. So you can use this in your sort of your go, no-go decisions for safety-critical tasks. You can get people using this and saying, well, you know, there's an estimate here that my performance might be low, my fatigue might be high. Is it close to what I'm actually experiencing? Should we do something about it? Should we cancel the mission? Okay. Now, Jason's going to talk a bit more about technological solutions in the next talk. Now, all we've looked at is one fatigue risk factor. I have a process, a set of forms that I use that can guide you through the assessment of all 6 fatigue risk factors. I'd happily give you that set of forms. Just send me a text, and I'll get it to you in the next week or so. Okay, how are we doing on time? Do we have a little bit of time for questions? Quarter two? So happy to entertain some questions if you'd like. Might be hitting our post-lunch dip. No questions here? Question over here.
Oh, just thanks. I just have a question about, obviously this is really useful for these kinds of very severe incidents. I work in healthcare, healthcare food services, and the injuries that we tend to have, I suspect that fatigue is a factor, but I'm not sure how, because the lower severity, we wouldn't necessarily be able to apply these tools in the same way. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on using them in different contexts.
Yeah, so I use this method. So lots of companies are interested in making sure they're producing enough widgets, right? Are we getting the productivity we want to experience out of somebody? There's no crash there. It's not a big boom, but there's a negative outcome there. So you can use things like slips, trips, and falls as your accident or your incident, and use the exact same process to look backwards and see, were they fatigued, and did it play a role in, say, a needle stick or some of the incidents that you're seeing. I've used it in safety context, health contexts, productivity. Sick leave is a big one. Is the sick leave we're seeing in our organization because of fatigue? So what you'd have to do is not just look at sick leave in general. You'd have to look at, well, last time Clint called in sick, was he fatigued at the time? Or was he sick because of fatigue too? So yeah, you can use it in all sorts of contexts. Obviously, I can't go through the whole investigation process in 45 minutes. It's actually built into a safety investigation process that I call the critical incident investigation process, and both can be used to look at a variety of different negative outcomes.
I work in silviculture, so tree planters, and so they're physically exhausted. And what are the metrics for incorporating physical exhaustion to just sleep debt?
Yeah, so what we're really talking about today is this concept of, I refer to it as sleep-related fatigue. It's one form of fatigue that reliably gives us the performance impairments we saw. But you can become fatigued for a number of different reasons. In silviculture, you're moving around all day long, lifting heavy things all day long. Let me give you an example. Physical fatigue. If I were to get you to do something really corny, put your hand up like this and just keep opening your hand, opening and closing, what's eventually going to happen? You're not going to be able to do that anymore. But just because I had you do that for 3 hours doesn't mean you're going to fall asleep. So you have to design different metrics for this physical fatigue or to capture it. The thing you want to really keep in mind, though, is all of these types of fatigue can act synergistically to produce worse effects. So in silviculture, you're working with daylight hours, long, hard, heavy days. Are you making people sleep-related fatigued because you've got them awake for a long period of time? Now you're getting them physically fatigued as well. So the two can combine, but you have to look at different metrics. Yeah.
I have a question for you, Clint, right here.
Oh, hi.
I'm curious about the Readibands versus Fitbits or other kinds of devices. What can you tell us about those?
So when I first started in the fatigue and sleep-wake world, I could keep up with everything that was out there. In the technology world, the sleep and fatigue technology world, it's moving so fast that it's really hard to keep up with them. So the ones that I've looked at, the most well-validated wearable on the market today, and you can't, just Joe Blow on the street can't just go out and buy a Readiband. It's for commercial applications only. It's the most scientifically validated instrument out there. Yeah. The other nice thing too, as I mentioned, is there's some predictive abilities from it. You can predict into the future how you're going to do. There are other tools out there, like Fitbit is pretty good, but you'd still need, Fitbit doesn't tell you if you're fatigued. It just tells you about whether or not you're asleep or how much sleep you've got. So now you've still got to use that sleep-wake pattern and get some sort of fatigue or performance estimate out of it. So you can kind of MacGyver it to work, but this is still the best thing I've found so far. Yeah. Okay, so I guess that's it. Thanks very much, and I guess Jason's up next.
Appreciate it.